We're continuing our study here in Ephesians, and we're in chapter 6. We're getting close to wrapping up our study here. In our day, the struggle between employees and employers, management, and the blue-collar worker are well documented. It's not something that we're unfamiliar with at all. We see it testified to through the many and varied labor strikes that we've witnessed over the course of our lifetime. Many of the unions have broken to a very real degree to where a lot of those strikes aren't as effective as they once were. But we've witnessed a lot of them, from the auto workers' strikes that have affected the Caterpillar employees in that situation over the years. We've seen several of those. We've seen teacher strikes where school systems have literally been shut down. The air traffic controllers was another one of those major deals where the government actually got involved because they felt the safety, obviously, with no one taking care of how the planes are coming and going and their trajectories and flight plans and all that. Postal worker strikes stopped the mail. And then you got the stinking mess of garbage people quitting. It's always a stinking mess when they quit and they go on strike. But it's just, the point is that it's a conflict. It is something that has existed, and it has. Throughout history, you have those who are in authority, and then you have those who are under that authority, and there's this conflict. And each side ends up basically accusing the other of selfishness or unreasonableness. There's things that occur. And the question is, this morning, is where does the believer, where does the Christian fit in all of this? Where do we land in that kind of a struggle? And I'm going to tell you, that's a very real issue, by the way. I've talked to many Caterpillar workers who went through that and actually asked that very question: where do I land in this? I mean, here's what the word: where do I fit in all of this? And so that's a legitimate question. And I have to say this, as I've given this thought through these various things I've talked to you about, where we've seen these struggles between the management and the workers. I have to say I don't fully know the full picture of it, how that works, because the Word of God does leave room for the American citizen or for a citizen under laws to utilize the laws of the existing government that we're under. That's our authority, and we can utilize those, not just for personal advancement, but to hold off or stave off injustice. So that side of the coin is there. I mean, there is that is there. It's in the Word of God. But one thing I do know is that the Word is not silent totally as to the conflict, how the believer in his heart goes through these things, and even in his deeds. As he deals with the relationship of an employee-employer relationship. Now, that's by way of application, and we'll get to that in a moment. But if you remember in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 18, we're told there that we're to be filled with the Spirit. We're not to be drunk with wine, but be filled with the Spirit. And as a result, we are to be submissive to one another in the fear of Christ, as you move on down in that same context. And we've already looked at, so far, at the practical side of this mutual submission in relationship to husbands and wives, and also parents and children. We've already looked at that. We've considered that. Today, we look at this mutual submission in regard to slaves and masters. And by way of making application, today, I've already referred to employees and employers, because we don't have a slave-master situation. But we do have we do have within our lives the employee-employer relationships that are there. So that's a parallel. And I have to say, it isn't even really, you can't say it's an accurate parallel. I mean, how do you make that the same as a slave master? And I'll get to that as we move through here, because that's what makes this very challenging to you and me as maybe an employer or an employee. Because he's talking about slaves-master relationship. Paul is. That's the historical context of the time, and this is where he goes with this lesson. How we reflect our blessed God in that relationship. Because that is our purpose. Our God is blessed not because we say so, but because He is, and He's proven that blessedness and how He's worked in our salvation, and then that works itself out practically in our lives, and we become the conduit through which He reveals Himself. The blessedness to each other and to the world. So I want to look at these verses here. Look at 5 through 9. Slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters, according to the flesh, and with fear and trembling, in the sincerity of your heart as to Christ, not by way of eye service as men pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. With goodwill render service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good thing each one does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether slave or free. And masters, do the same to them, and give up threatening, knowing that both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him. So what do we have here by way of a proposition? Here's what we have if you're taking your notes. Whether we are Christian employees or Christian employers, we are to work in mutual submission, knowing that Christ will reward accordingly. Let me repeat it. Whether we are Christian employees or Christian employers, we are to work in mutual submission, knowing that Christ will reward accordingly. And by the way, in connection with our overall theme, it is in this manner that we become a proper conduit whereby we reveal our blessed God. Getting back to the overall theme. So how do we do it? How do we do this? That's the question we would ask of that assertion, okay? If that's the case, how do we do that? What does that look like? How does that happen? Well, in this passage, Paul, as we've read, he addresses two different groups of people, groups of believers, by the way, believing masters and believing slaves, and he addresses them, and in so doing, he shows us how this mutual submission is to be rendered, how we do this, what it's supposed to look like. But there's a few things that I want to say before we actually look at those two groups. One is this. First, it is important to note that Paul is talking to Christians and not the lost. Okay? He's talking to Christian slaves and Christian masters. That's who he's talking to. And this is why he can be so authoritative here concerning this mutual submission. Why he can tell slaves, this is what you're supposed to do. This is how it's supposed to be. And he says, you masters, you do the same thing. And how does he say that? Because these are believers. And what it tells us is that whatever context we're in, being a believer means something. It means something. It has to mean something no matter the context. Wherever God places us, whatever lot we find ourselves in, we are believers. And that should mean something. And it should look a certain way. Because God has a greater purpose than just me in the moment. He's showing himself through me by how I function in that capacity, how I live in the moment, in that that circumstance that I am in as a Christian believer. And in this case, slaves and masters. So it's important for us to get that side of the coin. Second, this attitude of submission should be manifested regardless of whether we work for a non-Christian or whether we have non-Christian employees. Point being, just what I said. If we are a Christian employee, you just trying to draw some kind of a practical parallel for our place. But if we're in historical context, if I'm a Christian slave or if I'm a Christian employee, it doesn't matter whether I'm under a non-Christian boss or master, or my slaves or my employees are unbelievers. It doesn't change my obligation as a Christian employee or a Christian master. I think we understand what I'm saying. It's got to mean something for me in my lot, my particular specific circumstance, okay? Third, we need to realize that Paul isn't condoning slavery. He is in no way, by his silence to this institution, condoning it, or by what he even says here. That's not his purpose. He isn't directly, obviously, overthrowing the institution here. We don't see that at all. We see man's basic problems here and his needs, and what goes on here. Let me preface it with this. With what he leaves out, the way he doesn't attack the institution here, he just speaks to the spiritual side of this as to the man. There's something that surfaces here, and that is this: man's basic problems and needs aren't political, they're not social, and they're not even economic. They're spiritual. That's where it counts. Whatever the circumstance I'm in, I could say it's this or that, but if I am living a certain way as a believer in that, not as God would have me to do, there's the problem. There's the issue. And for the believer, that's what should concern us more than the state itself. Now, if I was a slave, I don't think I'd like that. I'm just being honest with you. I wouldn't like that at all. But this is the context historically they're in. And by the way, some of you may not like being an employee. You would much rather be the boss. But what does that mean? It doesn't mean just because I want that, it's going to change. I still have to go to work and be what I've hired on to be, whether it's to be a boss or whether it's an employee, whatever that is. But it doesn't change my need here, and that is it's a spiritual thing. Christianity, by the way, folks, when it's properly embraced and when it's properly lived out, is the most liberating teaching that's ever existed. And I mean, yes, spiritually, but even as it relates to this relationship. If you have a believing boss who actually functions as a boss, that's liberating to the employees, but even to him. And for vice versa, if a Christian employees are living as they should in that context, that's liberating. It may not change their situation, but as far as their status, but it changes the whole perspective of how they go through the moment, and that's what we're about today. So let's go ahead and let's look at this first group. Group number 1, and let's see how this mutual submission works itself out. Verses 5 and 8. Slaves, be obedient to those, 5 through 8. Slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in the sincerity of your heart, as to Christ, not by way of eye service as men pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. With good will render service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good thing each one does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether slave or free. So the first group is this: slaves. Slaves are to be subject to their masters. He says, be obedient to your masters. Obedience obedience is one of the first fruits of true submission. If you truly are submitted in a mutual submission, you will be able to obey. If you have a right attitude, you can obey freely. It's not going to be a big struggle. We'll talk about if they take us down a godless path in a moment. But this employees, if we're parallel, this employees are to be subject, are to obey and be subject to the employers. Listen, you can't walk on a job and just up and tell the boss, I'm not doing what you say, but I'm staying and I'm going to do what I want to do. If I walk on a construction site and I want to cut boards all day, I can't walk over to the sawhorse and just start whacking 2x4s and 2-foot chunks when he wants 8-footers for stud walls. I'm not cutting 8-footers. I'm cutting 2-footers. That's what I'm doing. Guess how long your job lasts? You're out of there. You're gone. Why? Because he's the boss. He's in authority. You can't do that. It just doesn't work that way. And we all know that. We all understand that. Well, and even in the slave-master relationship, the slave can't even change his state. He doesn't get a say. But what Paul tells that slave is that you need to obey. But he goes further, and we'll see that in a moment. It's from a submissiveness. It's from that submission, that mutual submission that he spoke to back in chapter 5 and verse 21, and be subject to one another in the fear of the Lord. That is the heart of brothers, of Christians. It's not my way or the highway, it's God's way in my circumstances, whatever they might be. I'm yielded to that, and that allows me to yield to others. It allows me to have the right heart in whatever state I'm in. Whether I want to be in that, I'm sure they didn't want to be slaves, but I can look right. I can look good for the Lord in that circumstance. I can shine for Jesus in that circumstance if I have the right heart, if I get there. Well, you might say, listen, that's easy. That's easy for you. Your boss is the Lord, Pastor. My boss is a total jerk. Well, that may be, but whether they're jerks or not, it doesn't change your obligation. Because you can't change him. You can only deal with your heart. You can only deal with you and how you go through the moment, through the circumstance. That's your concern. What do I look like in this moment for the Lord? Is the Lord being revealed? Am I a conduit through which he's being revealed? Am I mirroring my blessed God in the circumstance that I'm in? And I'm going to tell you, by the way, we have known slaves in the Old Testament that serve as prime examples of those who were in slave circumstances who shined in such a way that they were elevated. Joseph, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, they threw him in the lion's den. They did, but what were these guys? They stood out. The kings recognized their value. Were they God's men? Absolutely. Did they compromise anything as to the Lord in their certain? No, they didn't. And ultimately, that was rewarded. But they were rewarded even physically in the moment. In the chronology of the time, they were rewarded because of their submissive heart, their attitude, in their circumstances. God shined. He shined. So there's examples of that. But submission, it's a tough thing. It can be a tough thing. But obedience here called for is a present tense verb in the language, this obedience, and it speaks to, it's to be an uninterrupted attitude. It's just a state that you exist in as an employee. As a slave in history, if you want to shine for the Lord, then obey. then serve the Lord in that capacity and do what a good slave would do, and that's be in submission to those in authority over you, your masters, and obey them. So we're to obey at all times and in everything, whether they are unreasonable or not. Go over to 1 Peter. I want to give you a parallel, real quick text here. 1 Peter chapter 2, and it pretty much says this exact same thing in 18 through 20. Servants, be submissive to your masters with all respect, not partial respect. What kind of respect? All respect. Not only to those who are good and gentle, but also to those who are unreasonable, the jerks. Even them. Now listen why. Gar clause. For this finds favor. If for the sake of conscience toward God a person bears up under sorrows when suffering unjustly, that finds favor with God. That kind of heart that can shine for Him in the midst of injustice and maintain an attitude that is a conduit through which God can reveal Himself is favored by our God. He favors that kind of a heart, and he goes on to explain, for what credit is there if when you sin and are harshly treated, you endure it with patience. But when you do what is right and suffer for it, you patiently endure it. This finds favor with God. He's saying, listen, if you act like an idiot and you get what's coming, what do you expect? What do you expect? It's when you do what's unexpected and you show the heart of God in the circumstances that God is able to shine. And God favors that. And we find over in our text, He rewards accordingly. He's going to. This doesn't get past the Lord. You may think, man, he's asleep on the job here because I've been enduring this boss for too long. Well, listen, keep shining for the Lord because He sees every bit of it. He takes note of it. He sees it. And you will be rewarded accordingly. It's only natural to obey, listen, and this was the point of that text, but I want to say this. It's only natural to obey somebody when everything's going your way. If everything's easy, it's okay. You know, I can get along with anybody. As long as he's thinking like me, we're good to go. But when he's not, that's when God can shine. That's when you show you're different. Some of you guys have maybe been through the strikes, and instead of being venomous toward management, you may have even walked out on the strike, but you weren't hateful about it. You weren't slanderous about it. And they're like, well, why aren't you this way like the rest of us? What's that? Because you're different. You're shining as different. You're showing yourself there's something, you're showing yourself as something different than the others who don't know the Lord. And that's the point here. This is when we can really show our God. What we face today in America, in the marketplace, by way of injustices, folks, it doesn't even compare historically to what the slave masters endured. And I think that's important for us to get this, because that's who he's talking to. I'm going to give you a few examples. Cato, who was a Roman statesman, he made this statement about slaves. He said, old slaves should be thrown on the dump, a scrap heap. And when a slave is ill, you should not feed him or do anything. It is not worth your expense, your money. Take the six slaves and throw them away because they are nothing more than ineffectual tools. That's one of the attitudes that slaves were up against. Has your boss said that about you? Yeah, I think he has. Some of you. Management thinks just like that. Well, sad if they do. And we'll get to them in a moment. Augustus crucified a slave who accidentally killed a quail. A slave owner in history by the name of Augustus, he killed a slave because he accidentally killed a pet quail. A little like a Bob White. A life for the life of a quail? That's how little they meant to the culture of the moment. It's told of a slave owner whose greatest pleasure was, quote, listening to the sweet song of his slaves being flogged. Pretty demented, pretty sick. But that's what they were up against. That's what we're talking about. And here's Paul telling those people in a culture that viewed slaves much that way, as those quotes speak of, he tells them, you obey. You obey. You submit. That's what he tells them. So we're not up against near this kind of a situation, and yet he tells them to be obedient. Now, how do we do it? Paul he enlarges on this obedience by setting forth what is to characterize or accompany this obedience. There's 5 of these. First is a proper perspective. Look at verse 5. Slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh. According to the flesh. As to Christ, he says. That speaks to perspective. How you view it will oftentimes determine how you act in the moment. And what Paul's intent here is to emphasize that while we are to obey our employees or our masters, if we were in the slave-master context, while we're to obey them, we need to realize that this is only temporal. You say, well, how do we know that? According to the flesh. This will change. According to the moment, according to what we live in, we live here in the flesh. It lasts only for this lifetime, for what you're facing, whatever your circumstances would be, and it doesn't apply to the spiritual arena as it relates to your relationship to that master. It's not going to carry over forever. According to the flesh. The obedience rendered should be perceived as well as to Christ. By the way, this is what he told the wives. He even told the husbands that they're to love as Christ loved. He tells the children they're to obey in the Lord. And the fathers, that our heart is to be in the Lord and not to provoke, but to nurture and discipline and instruct in the Lord. So the context is always in the Lord. For the Lord. Perspective. It changes everything. My obedience should be perceived as unto the Lord, for in reality, that's exactly what it is. Secondly, it's to be characterized by a right attitude. Verse 5 again, look at it. Slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling in the sincerity of your heart as to Christ. With fear and trembling. Fear speaks of reverence or respect. Trembling is an understanding of their authority. That's what it's saying. And slave master, he's saying, you need to understand this, with fear and trembling. They are in authority. The slave in ancient times basically had no rights at all. And so you need to know their authority. Recognize the authority granted. We're supposed to do the same with our government. Recognize their authority. If we live right under the authority, we have nothing to fear. It's when we rebel and we break the laws, then all of a sudden we have reason for real fear and trembling. Why? Because they have an authority. That's the place you find yourself in if you're a slave and you're in the master context, or whether you're an employee-employer. They can fire you. They can get you fired. most of them have greater authority, obviously, if they're in a position over you than you do. And so you need to recognize that. Also, there's to be sincerity here. To truly have the impact in the workplace that we should as believers, we have to come to the place where our service is rendered, not as just an obligation, as an employee that I go in here just to do a job, but it's to be rendered from a sincere heart as to Christ, as to the Lord. And I want to tell you something. I've seen it. I've seen it in lives, and I've seen people struggle with this in life. I've seen people who have struggled with bosses who are hard and unjust and almost in some cases abusive of their authority and hateful, just vindictive. And I've seen the person continue to try and prove themselves and not respond in kind, and that whole situation turn, where the person is recognized in the end as the employee is recognized as truly a good employee, because he's not there for that boss necessarily or the company. I'm there for the Lord. And I want in my circumstance for the Lord to be manifested here. And I'm going to tell you, if that's your heart, He will be. He will be. You'll show the Lord. So God has placed us there, so we need to embrace whatever our task with sincerity. I've said this in the employee-employer relationship. If you work in such a way as to make yourself invaluable, there's your best job security. Because if I have a choice between keeping a guy who's not willing to yield and to do what I ask of him, or keep the person who's there and he's doing the job from a heart that isn't a plague to the rest of the workforce, but he's just a shining example of what I would want my employees to be, that's not walking away. I'm keeping that as much as I can. There should be security in that. But then there's also to be consistency. Verse 6. Not by way of eye service as men pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. What this is saying is and you've seen these guys and gals who every time the boss is around, they are the epitome of the best employee possible. Well, that's not who you are. You're supposed to be the best employee, whether the eyes of the boss are on you, or they're in the other room, or they're even away. You should be the best you can be in the moment. There should be consistency. It shouldn't be something that comes and goes, because we're not men pleasers. Who are we pleasing? We're pleasing the Lord. My concern is with the one whose eyes never leave me. He sees me because I'm His child. You're His child. Finally, we're to do so with goodwill. Look at verse 7. With goodwill, render service as to the Lord and not to men. And this kind of falls in with the sincerity thing. But this goodwill, it actually speaks to a quietness or a peacefulness. You can do a job for somebody, and you can even do a good job, but you can be ugly doing it. Can't you? You can. I mean, if you told me to build something for you and I didn't really want to build it and I can't stand you, it doesn't mean I can't build whatever it is and actually turn out a good product. But getting to that good product was not a pretty picture. It was rather ugly. But I'm supposed to have goodwill, a peacefulness about how I function in my circumstance. It should look like a believer doing it. There should be a difference here, and that's what's in view. But look at the reason for the submission here, and this is where we come to as it relates to the slave. He says, knowing that whatever good thing each one does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether slaves or free. Now let's look at it again here. Knowing that whatever good thing each one does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether slave or free. Why would he receive it back from the Lord? You want to know why? Because he's already told us. Because why do we do it? We're doing it as for the Lord, to the Lord. What I give as a Christian in whatever circumstances, if my heart is to shine for the Lord, to be a conduit whereby I can reveal our blessed God, he sees that. You're rendering service for him, and he marks that. You will be, it doesn't say you might be, each thing, the good thing each one does, this he might receive. No, he will. You will receive this back from the Lord. He takes notice of this. And you will be rewarded. So every pill you felt was hard to swallow, but you swallowed it because you love the Lord in your circumstances. He's mindful of it. He sees that. He sees what? He sees that you placed him above what? Yourself. There's someone far more important here than me in the moment. And that's the Lord. That's the Lord. And he rewards accordingly. Going on to the masters, and this is the easiest one because look what it says. He doesn't even spend, the slaves had 1, 2, 3, 4 verses. Masters have 1 verse. And here's what he says. Masters, do the same. Pretty much that's what he says to them. And masters, do the same things to them and give up threatening. What's the message to the masters? To the believing masters, what's the message? The exact same heart that I'm asking of these slaves who are under you. You minister, you serve in your capacity, not minister, but you serve over them with the same heart of mutual submission, of one filled with the Spirit of God. Same heart as to the Lord. What you do should be for the Lord, even if it's in leadership. It should be with the spirit of sincerity. It should be not as pleasing men in my authority. I shouldn't wield my authority just because the management wants me to be a brute. That's not right. What I should do is look to reflect the Lord in the moment. And if I have that, if I'm at the top of the food chain and that's who I am as far as employee, employer, that should be how I minister. I'm going to tell you what happens with your employees. Do they have to go on strike? They shouldn't. Why do we have these situations, folk? Well, number one, we're not all saved. But sadly, many of the saved people in these circumstances do not look to shine for the Lord in the moment. We don't. We get caught up in it just the same as everybody else. But the reality is in a perfect world, if we had Christian bosses, Christian workers, and we had the right heart for each other in those circumstances, God shines every time. The Lord is able to reveal himself. We can get along, we can function, we can produce, we can do good things in those capacities. And we really won't resent each other if that was the right heart, if that's the case. But he gives them further motive here, and it's important that we see this because the masters have to understand, knowing, listen to what he says in verse 9, and masters, you do the same thing to them. You treat them with goodwill, in fear and trembling, all that goes along with it. As to the Lord, you're to do that. And then he goes on, he tells them to give up threatening, knowing that both their master and yours is in heaven. Is it one and the same? It is. That's the point. You're abusing my child. I'm their master. You're not. You are in this flesh, but I'm their master, and guess what? I'm yours as well. And then he says something that's terrifying to a person who thinks they're all that because of the authority they have in the flesh. And he tells them, there is what? There's no partiality with me. When you stand here, I'm not looking at slave, master. I'm looking at Christians and how you function in whatever state you were in. Did you function? Did you act for me? Did you serve me? Did you shine? Did you allow yourself by your attitude and your heart in your circumstances to be a conduit through which your blessed God could be manifested? That's the important question. That's what he says. Each of us accounts for how we serve him in our station in life, whatever that might be, every one of us. And God's not going to, there's no partiality. He just sees a child of his and how he functioned in that capacity. Our heart should be that we shine so that he can. That we would live in such a way to where our blessed God, people see him for who he is. Because he is blessed. We don't make him so, he is. And our goal should be to live in such a way to where that's manifested ongoingly. Whether we be masters or slaves or employees or employers, being a Christian ought to matter in whatever state. Let's pray together. Lord, we love you. We thank you for your word today. We thank you for the obvious applications that are here for us. And I pray, Lord, that we would not hold ourselves so high that we lose sight of that you've allowed us as children, bought and paid for by the blood of Christ, to enter a circumstance, a relationship whereby we are conduits through which you reveal yourself. You are far more important than the circumstances we are in. And I pray that wherever we are, as it relates to what we've considered today, whether we're bosses or we're employees, that we would act as Christians. Lord, truly act differently than the lost. Bless each one today, Lord, for being out. I thank you for them. I pray that you would bless our day. It's going to be busy with activity this afternoon and evening as we finish up setting up for our VBS. And I just pray that it would be well attended, that we'd come with hearts to serve tonight, and that we could get things accomplished quickly and have a great time of fellowship out together as well. But bless the week ahead as we minister, hopefully, Lord, to many young people in our community. But whether we have 30 here or 70, may we do so with enthusiasm and love for these young people, but more importantly, love for you, and truly try to have a lasting impact upon these young lives for your glory. But just bless the week ahead of us. Help us count, Lord, each one of us for you, and we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.